This video is the first video of a set of 3 videos where I'm going to explain how to do a simple map application where we can share your family members' locations on a map. Okay, so in order to do this, I'm going to use Backendless. Now, if you haven't followed my videos yet, go to my video where I actually explain what is Backendless and how to create an account and so forth. So I just created, or this is basically just the page. After you've logged in, you'll get to this page in Backendless, and then you can see you can go to develop.backendless.com if you want to log in there. And then after logging in, I've just created a new app called Map App Video. So it's as easy as clicking on Create App and give it a name. That's all. Okay, so it's called Map App Video, my application, and then you can see there's the application ID and the iOS and the Android API key. So we're going to use application ID and Android API key. So if we go to geolocation here, you can see that they also support maps and geopoints and stuff like that. So we're going to use Backendless libraries in order to save data on Backendless online, and then we can share this data between devices. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the home button there, which will give me my application ID and my Android API key. Okay, so let's go to Android Studio now. And in Android Studio, I just created a new blank application and I've added one maps activity. I've also copied this link, pasted the link, and I got my API key there, and I've already pasted my API key. Okay, so that's all I did so far. So what I want to do now is to make sure I'm also getting the permission there to use the internet, because we're going to save data online. And then I also want to add another user's permission here. You can see we access the find location. So I'm going to call course location as well. So I'm going to use find location and course location there, and the permission to use the internet. Okay, so now what I want to do in order to set up Backendless, you're going to say new Java class. And I'm going to call this the application class. I'm going to say okay. And I'm just going to say extends application. And that is the android.app.application. And then I'm going to go to code override methods, and I want to have the onCreate method there. Okay, so now in order for Backendless to work, the Backendless API to work in my application, I need to go to the Gradle build file. So let's go to Gradle scripts, build.gradle, and you need to add one line there. So I'm going to say compile, and then we're going to use com.backendless colon, and then we're going to say Backendless, and then the version that you want to use. So I'm just going to use this one. This is a stable version for me, 401. You can also use a newer one. So I'm going to say sync, and then it syncs, it adds that library. Okay, the error here is because I've spelled compile wrongly there, so let's just try again there. Right, so now it's compiled the Backendless library into my application. So what I can do now in the application class is to basically just go and call Backendless. And there, if you can see Backendless there, the Backendless libraries are actually ready to go and you can use them. So I'm going to use set URL, and the URL that we're going to set there must be https and then 2/API.backendless.com. So that's the URL that we're going to connect to get the API there. And then we're going to say backendless.initialize the app. And now there's 3 arguments there. So first one you're going to pass in the application context. The second argument is your application ID. So go back to Backendless, to the website, click on the home button there, and that's your application ID there. So you're going to click copy to the clipboard for your specific app. You can't use my values, it won't work on your side. And you're going to paste them there. Let me just paste it quickly. Oh, what have I done now? Let me just go back. Copy it again. Go back to Android Studio, and I'm going to paste it there. Okay, so that is then the application ID. And then the last argument there will basically be, if you go back to the website again, your Android API key. So you're going to copy that one, go back to Android Studio, and you're going to paste your application ID there. Okay, so that's all we need for Backendless to get initialized, is by calling set the URL and initialize the app. But now the application class is the class that runs first in my application, even before my launcher activity. So let's go to the manifest quickly, and anywhere there under the application tag, you need to add the name property. And if you start typing name there, you can see there's application class. It picks up my application class. So basically what happens now, the Android manifest knows that this application class, which is this one, is the class that should run right at the beginning. And this will then set up my app, and I can then start using the libraries, connecting to Backendless Online and saving data. Right, so now that Backendless is set up correctly and our Android manifest is fine, let's just go to, I'm going to close down the maps activity. For now, let's just work a bit on the activity main XML. So what I want to do there in the main activity, I want to use a linear layout, and this linear layout must have an orientation of vertical, and I'm going to remove the text view there. So what we want to do in this design now, let me just see if I can get a bit more space here for this design now. So what we want to do is to drag in a few buttons there. So I'm going to go to the palette, and I'm going to drag in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 buttons. We're going to drag in 5 buttons there, and we're going to use these buttons to basically show information or to send through information to the map on what we want to do. So I'm going to select all of those buttons, and what I want to do is to just set, just select them again. I want to set the layout margin on the left. Let's make it 20, on the right also 20, and at the top let's make it 10. Okay, so these are the buttons, and we're going to set the text to the buttons now. I think let's just see if we can make our buttons a bit better by going to the drawable folder and say new drawable resource file, and let's call this one buttons and say OK. And now instead of having a selector there, we will use the shape, which will be an Android shape. So we're going to define that shape now, and this will be an Android shape. And the shape that we're going to use is the rectangle. Okay, so we're going to define how our buttons should look like. So we're going to use a solid there, which is the solid color. And I'm going to set the color there to, let's just use a hash F2, F2, F2. So it's a type of a gray there. And then we close off the solid color. Then we'll define some corners to give it a round, basically make the corners of the button a bit round. So I'm going to set the Android radius there to, let's say, 200 dp. So you can play around with that value. Making it bigger or smaller will make the corners more round or less round. And then we're going to add a gradient. And the gradient, I'm going to have an Android start color there. And we're going to start off with this same color there. Let's just copy that color there. I'm going to start off with that same color. And then we also need to have an Android end color there. And we're going to basically end with a color A4, 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 which is a bit darker type of gray. And then we're also going to set the Android angle there to 270 degrees. That's just the angle of the gradient. You can also play around with that value. Okay, so that's the gradient. Then we're going to have a stroke, which is basically just an outline on your button. And we're going to set the Android width property there. And let's set that one to 0.4 pixels. That's the thickness of the line that's on the outside of the button. And then we're going to set the color for that line. And I want that color to be also this A4, A4, A4. So I'm going to copy it and paste it there. And then we just close it down. Okay, so that's how every single one of my buttons should look like. So let's go back to the buttons. And if we click on the buttons now, we can set the background property. You can see on the drawable, we've got the buttons XML now. So I'm going to click on, select all those buttons. And I'm going to set, where's the background property now? Just go get all those buttons again. and we want to have the background property there, and we called it buttons under the drawable folder. And you can see there my buttons now is taking a gray type of gradient type of look there. Now it looks just a bit better than the normal buttons. Okay, so then the text on the buttons. So let's use the first button there as the first button should show the family's location. So let's call it BTN family. And then the next button we'll call BTN. So let's say we're going to have a Peter to log in. So we're just going to simulate a login type of situation where somebody logs into the app and shares his location. And for this button, we're going to show family location. For this one, we're going to say login Peter. And then we're going to have another person there. Let's say BTN Tabu. And then we will say login Tabu. Then the next button we will have, let's say Nelson, and we will simulate here logging in Nelson. And then we're going to have a last button there that we're going to call BTN, let's call it Susan, and then we're going to say login Susan. Now, if you want to have this text now, you see it has a problem there because it's hard-coded and it should be in the strings resource. So if you want to add it to your strings resource, just click on it, Alt-Enter. The very first option there is extract the string resource. So you're going to click on it and just click again. It gives it a name. Alt-Enter. Well, you can give it the resource another name there, but login_Peter is fine for me, and the text obviously taken from what I've typed there. And then Alt-Enter again. Same thing there, and the same thing there. Okay, so that is basically setting all those text to the strings XML. And now you can see this is how my button should look. Show family location, login Peter, login Tabu, login Nelson, and login Susan. So let's get to the main activity quickly and set up those buttons. So I'm going to set button. The first button is the family button. The second button is for Peter. The third button is for, what was it, Tabu. Then the next one was for Nelson. And the last one was for Susan. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. Okay, so let's just set them up in coding then. BTN family equals a button, find the view by its ID, r.id.btn family. Okay, so that's how you type that. I've got a shortcut type of code there, just this one. So I'm going to use Peter there, and it basically does the whole thing for me. Let's take the next one, which is Tabu. And the next one, which is Nelson. And then the last one, which will be Susan. Right, so there's all the buttons set up. What we also can do now is just quickly set up the on-click listeners. So for the family one, we're going to set the on-click listener to a new on-click listener so that when the button gets clicked, it will go to this on-click. I'm going to copy this one because we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different buttons to be clicked. So the next one will be Peter. If Peter gets clicked, it's going to go to this on-click. Then the next one, Tabu. And then the next one, Nelson. And the last one will be Susan. Okay, and that is basically setting up all the buttons from my main activity. So when we click a specific button, we're going to take all of these buttons to the same maps activity. But when we click it, we'll see now that we're going to check or we're going to send through information about which one of these buttons was clicked, and then our map activity will do whatever we said that map activity should do when it gets that specific information from the button. So in the main activity, we've set up all the buttons. So now what do we want to do if we click on a button? And the main thing here is to just send through information to the maps activity on which one was clicked. So what we're going to do now is to use an intent, and we're going to send through data for that specific intent. But first, before we click this, we must make sure that the user has got access to actually use the maps and the find and the course location. Now, in order to do that, we need to use that Android 6 permission. So I've done a video on Android 6 permissions. Please go through that video again. I'm not going to explain everything in detail again on what is Android 6 permissions, but basically if you're using some of the dangerous permissions on the Android developers website, then you must use this Android 6 type of permissions where you're asking, when you're using a feature, you can ask encoding for that feature to be accepted or not. Okay, so we're going to use context compat.check self permission. Just check if there's a permission so that we can use the GPS of the phone to get the location. So the first value there will be the context. So I'm going to call it get application context. The second argument will then be your string permission, or your permission in the form of a string that you want to check for if that permission has been granted. So I'm going to use manifest of Android, so it's going to be android.manifest basically, dot permission, and then I'm going to use one of the permissions that we can have there is access the course location. So I'm going to check if the course location is not equal to, and then we're going to go to the package manager. So I'm just going to go to the new line there, package manager dot permission granted. So basically what I'm testing is I'm testing if the permission access course location has been granted or not. And then I'm going to add an or statement there because I want to check for another one as well. So I'm going to take this whole thing again, copy it, and I want to check for another one, paste it. Let me just go to a new line. So for this one, we check if the context compact.check self permission, in this case, not access the course location, but we're going to say access find location to also get the GPS. The course location is the triangulation of your towers, and then the find location is for the GPS. And if that one is also not granted. Right, so this if statement basically checks if course location and find location permission has been granted. And then the else part will be then if, remember this one says if it's not granted and it's not granted. So if it's not granted, what do we want to do? We call activity compat dot request that permission then. So then we request the user to actually give us permission to do so. And the first argument, again, the context or basically the activity. So you're going to say main activity dot this. And then the second argument you will see is a string of all the permissions that you want to ask for. So I'm going to say new string or string array with all the permissions that you want to ask for. Okay, so that's a new string, and then we're going to pass in all the permissions that we want to ask for. So the first one is the manifest dot, and it's basically this same permission that we asked for there, the access course location. So we're going to say access course location, that's the first one. The second one exactly the same, manifest dot permission dot access the find location. Let me just go to a new line there. Okay, so there's the new string. After that, you can just pass in a request code there. So I'm not going to do the whole thing of Android 6 permissions. So on my video, you will learn a bit more about that request code and what it does. For now, I'm just going to pass in a 0 there, just to get the permission from the user. Okay, so now in the else part, the else part means that the user has already given us permission to access the course and the find location. So then in the else part, we've got the permission and we can now launch the map activity. So I'm going to say intent equals new intent. And the activity that I want to launch now is under Java there. You'll see there's my maps activity. So that's the one I want to launch. So first main activity dot this, the context. Second argument, the class that you want to launch, which is the maps activity. Just remember the dot class there. And then to that intent, I'm going to add some extra data on which button was clicked. So in this case, it's the family button that was clicked. So in the put extra method, I'm going to add a type there. And the type for this one will be family. So this button that gets clicked, the type will be family. For Peter, we were going to set the type to Peter there. Okay. And then we just say start activity. And we pass in that intent, which will start the maps activity, but it will send through some extra data. The name of the data is type, and the data will be called family. Right, so I'm going to do the exact same thing. So I'm going to copy this if and else. I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to do the same thing in Peter, but instead of the type being family there, I'll set the type to Peter. Then the same for Tabu. That type will then just be Tabu there. And for Nelson, the type will just be Nelson. And for Susan, the type will just be Susan. So now when we click on any one of those buttons, it will take us to the same Google Maps activity, but with different information. So clicking on the family button will send through information family. Clicking on Peter will send through Peter. Clicking on Tabu will send through Tabu, and so forth. So different things happen for different buttons, but it's all going to the same maps activity. So in the maps activity, we'll need to test if it's from the family or if it's Peter or who has accessed that specific activity. Now the last thing for this video, to basically go to Backendless. If you look at Backendless and you go to geolocation, you will see that we've got categories there. So we can add a new category by just clicking on the plus there. So let's say you can have a category for family, and you click on create, and you can have a category for friends, for example, and you can have a category for, let's say, fun. And then you can add geo points in any one of those categories, so that if you want to retrieve only your family geo points, you can do so by going to a specific category. So this is what we're going to do in coding now, to see how in coding can we create a new category here. For instance, you could have family members that's fun, which means that you'll put a point or a geo point in the family and in the fun, the same geo point. So then if you want to get all the people that's fun and family, you can just retrieve both of those points. Okay, but in any case, I'm going to delete them quickly. So if you delete, just click on the delete button there. For the family, I'm going to delete, and for friends, I'm going to delete. Okay, so then we've deleted all of the categories there. We will set up the categories in coding. So how do we set up that category in coding? So this is actually very easy. You're going to call backendless.geo. So everything on the geolocations, you use the geo class there. So it's going to be backendless.geo.add category. And the category that we want to add there, you can just name by naming it a normal string there. So remember, for Backendless using Android, we're going to use the one with the 2 arguments there. So you've seen 2 arguments there. The first one is the string for your category. So I'm going to call the category my family. And the second argument, you need to use the new async callback. And that does the whole thing for you in the background, creating that category for you if it doesn't exist. Okay, so this is how you create it. Now, the naming of your category, very important here, there could be characters of A to Z, capital A to Z. You can also have the character or the letters, sorry, the numbers 0 to 9, and then you can also use the underscore. But that's all that you can use. And you can start with the A to Z, but you cannot start with 0 to 9. Okay, so that's basically what's allowed in your category. So after doing this, then if we run the application now, if you connect it to the internet and you run it, you will see that this new family category was created then online. Okay, so that's what it does. So this Backendless add category method, the new async callback, if it's done creating that category online, it will go into handle response, and then you can do what you want to do. And then if it goes to handle fault, you know that there's been a problem there, and you can use this fault object, and you can just call get message, which will show you the fault. Okay, so that's basically just adding a category, but we actually don't need to do it directly like this, because when you add a new geo point to a category and the category does not exist, it will also create the category. But if you are in need of creating a category explicitly like we're doing it here, this is how you would do it.